Hi, I'm Maya. The day my brother laughed at my inheritance, I thought my grandfather had forgotten me. When Derek smirked and said I got the family's leftover scraps while he inherited the real empire, I believed him. After all, everyone always believed Derek. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But 3 months later, when James Morrison from First National called me into his private office and slid a manila folder across his mahogany desk, everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled. The numbers on those offshore account statements didn't lie, and neither did the recorded message my grandfather left specifically for me. Derek hadn't just underestimated what I inherited. He had no idea what our grandfather really thought of him, but that revelation was still months away. The humiliation started the moment we walked into the Old Mill restaurant on that gray October afternoon, where our family's attorney had arranged the reading of Harold Westfield's will. The restaurant felt too cheerful for what we were about to endure. Warm amber lighting spilled across rustic wooden tables, and the scent of rosemary and garlic drifted from the kitchen. Other diners chatted quietly over their meals, completely unaware that our family was about to be dissected and distributed according to the wishes of a man who had controlled us all, even from his grave. I sat at the far end of the reserved corner table, smoothing down my navy blazer for the third time. I'd chosen it carefully that morning, hoping to project competence and belonging, though I suspected it made little difference. In this family, perception had always mattered more than reality, and my perception had been cemented years ago. Maya, the dreamer. Maya, the impractical one. Maya, who chose teaching over business and small apartments over mansions. Derek arrived 15 minutes late, as usual, striding through the restaurant like he owned it. At 34, 2 years older than me, he moved with the confident swagger of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than I made in a month as a high school English teacher, and his Rolex caught the light as he pulled out his chair directly across from the attorney. "Sorry I'm late," he announced to the table, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "Board meeting ran over. You know how it is." He glanced at me with that familiar smirk. "Well, maybe you don't." Emma, my younger sister, shot him a warning look. At 28, she'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who tried to smooth over the sharp edges of our family dynamics. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she wore a simple black dress that managed to look both respectful and expensive. Emma had mastered the art of floating between Derek's world and mine, never fully committing to either side. "Derek, please," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Even Emma knew that today wasn't about family harmony. Today was about division, about who mattered and who didn't. Our parents sat side by side at the head of the table, presenting their usual united front. Patricia Chen had been Harold Westfield's only daughter, and she'd inherited his steel spine along with his steel gray eyes. Her silver hair was styled in the same elegant bob she'd worn for 20 years, and her black Chanel suit looked like armor. Dad, Robert Chen, sat quietly beside her, his weathered hands folded on the table. He'd built his own construction company from nothing, but he'd always deferred to Mom when it came to her father's business empire. The attorney, a thin man named Richard Hawthorne, cleared his throat and opened a thick leather portfolio. I'd met him twice before, both times at formal family gatherings, where he'd hovered near my grandfather like a well-dressed shadow. He had the kind of pale, indoor complexion that suggested he spent most of his time buried in legal documents, and his wire-rimmed glasses reflected the restaurant's warm lighting. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the practiced solemnity of someone who'd delivered both fortunes and disappointments. "As you know, Harold Westfield was very specific about how he wanted his estate handled. He spent considerable time ensuring that his wishes were clear and legally sound. I found myself thinking about the last time I'd seen Grandpa Harry alive. He'd been in Hartford General Hospital, connected to machines that beeped and hummed around the clock. His once commanding presence had been reduced to a frail figure lost in starched white sheets, but his mind had remained sharp until the very end. I'd visited him every day for 3 weeks, reading to him from the classics he'd taught me to love when I was younger. Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Mark Twain. We'd discussed literature and life, and he'd listened to my stories about my students with genuine interest. Derek had visited twice. The estate, Hawthorne continued, consists of several components. The primary residence on Maple Ridge Drive, valued at approximately $4.2 million. The controlling interest in Westfield Industries, currently valued at roughly $38 million. Various investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and personal effects. The total estate value is approximately $57 million. I felt my stomach clench. $57 million. I'd known Grandpa Harry was wealthy, but hearing the number spoken aloud made it feel both more real and more impossible. This was the kind of money that changed lives, that bought freedom and security and power. This was the kind of money I'd never see. The house, Hawthorne announced, consulting his papers, goes to Patricia Chen, with the understanding that it will remain in the family for future generations. Mom nodded, unsurprised. She'd grown up in that house, had brought her own children there for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. It made sense that it would return to her. The controlling interest in Westfield Industries, he continued, along with the associated voting rights and board positions, goes to Derek Chen. Derek's smile was immediate and triumphant. He'd been groomed for this moment his entire life, shadowing Grandpa Harry through board meetings and business dinners, learning the intricacies of the manufacturing empire that had built our family's wealth. The company produced specialized industrial equipment, the kind of boring but essential products that generated steady profits year after year. It wasn't glamorous, but it was lucrative. The investment portfolios, Hawthorne read, totaling approximately $8 million, are divided between Emma Chen and Derek Chen, with Emma receiving the larger portion at $5.3 million. Emma's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her composure. $8 million between the two of them, with Emma getting the majority. It was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, but in the context of the total estate, it felt almost like a consolation prize. I waited for my name to be called, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Around the table, my family members had already begun to mentally organize their inheritances, their faces reflecting various degrees of satisfaction and calculation. Derek looked like someone who'd just won the lottery, which, in many ways, he had. To Maya Chen, Hawthorne finally said, and every head turned toward me. Harold Westfield leaves his personal library, his writing desk, and his collection of fountain pens. Additionally, he leaves her his summer house on Lake Winnisquam in New Hampshire, along with a trust fund containing $50,000 for the property's maintenance and upkeep. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt heat creep up my neck and settle in my cheeks. Around the table, I could sense the mixture of pity and embarrassment radiating from my family. $50,000 for maintenance. A summer house that probably hadn't been updated since the 1980s. A desk and some books. Derek broke the silence with a low whistle. Wow, Maya. Books in an old cabin. You really hit the jackpot there. Derek, Emma warned again, but her voice was softer now, tinged with what sounded like sympathy. What? Derek spread his hands innocently. I'm just saying. Grandpa was always practical. He gave everyone what suited them best, right? Maya loves books, so she gets books. I understand business, so I get the business. Makes perfect sense. The words stung because there was just enough truth in them to make them believable. I had always been the bookish one, the one who preferred stories to spreadsheets. When Derek had been learning about profit margins and market analysis, I'd been curled up in Grandpa Harry's library, reading everything I could get my hands on. When Emma had been networking at country club events, I'd been volunteering at literacy programs and tutoring struggling students. Maybe this was what I deserved. Maybe this was all I was worth. There are a few additional stipulations, Hawthorne continued, consulting his notes. Derek, your inheritance comes with the requirement that you maintain the company's current employment levels for at least 5 years. Emma, your portfolio includes several educational trust funds that Harold established for underprivileged children in the Hartford area. You'll be overseeing their distribution. Derek nodded impatiently. Employment levels weren't a problem. If anything, the company had been growing steadily, and he'd been pushing for expansion into new markets. Emma smiled genuinely for the first time that afternoon. She'd always been drawn to charitable work, though she'd never had the resources to make a real impact before. "And Maya," Hawthorne said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, "your grandfather left specific instructions regarding the summer house. He wanted you to spend at least one full weekend there before making any decisions about its future. He also left you this." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Grandpa Harry's distinctive handwriting. The paper felt thick and expensive, and I could feel something small and hard inside. "What is it?" Derek asked, craning his neck to get a better look. "It's sealed," I said quietly, slipping the envelope into my purse. "I'll read it later." "Oh, come on," Derek pressed. "We're all family here. Open it up. Maybe it's another fountain pen." His tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it that made me uncomfortable. Derek had never liked mysteries, especially ones that didn't involve him directly. Throughout our childhood, he'd been the one to shake wrapped presents and peek into closets, convinced that secrets were just information he hadn't accessed yet. "I'll read it when I get home," I repeated, more firmly this time. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of legal technicalities and signature requirements. There were papers to sign, accounts to transfer, and timeline to discuss. Derek immediately began asking questions about when he could take over his board responsibilities, while Emma inquired about the logistics of managing the educational trusts. I sat quietly, my purse feeling heavier than usual with the weight of Grandpa Harry's final message to me. When we finally left the restaurant, the October air felt sharp and clean after the stuffiness inside. The leaves on the maple trees lining the street had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and they crunched under our feet as we walked toward the parking lot. "Well," Derek said, stretching his arms above his head like he'd just finished a satisfying workout. "That went about as expected. Dad, we should schedule a meeting with the board next week. I want to start implementing some changes right away." Dad nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We'll need to be careful about the transition. Your grandfather built strong relationships with all the major clients. We don't want to disrupt anything unnecessarily." "Of course not," Derek agreed, but I could hear the impatience in his voice. He'd been waiting years to put his own stamp on Westfield Industries, and now that the opportunity was finally here, 5-year employment requirements weren't going to stop him from making his mark. Emma walked beside me, her heels clicking against the pavement. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I shrugged. "I'm fine. It's what I expected." "The summer house could be nice," she offered. "You always loved it up there as kids. Remember how Grandpa used to take us fishing?" I did remember. Some of my happiest childhood memories involved that little house on Lake Winnisquam. Grandpa Harry had taught me to bait hooks and identify different types of fish. We'd spent hours on the old wooden dock, him sharing stories about his own childhood while I peppered him with questions about everything and nothing. Derek had usually been too busy with sports camps or academic enrichment programs to join us, and Emma had preferred the country club's pool to the lake's murky water. "Yeah," I said softly, "it'll be nice to see it again." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that nice wasn't enough. Nice didn't pay off student loans or fund retirement accounts. Nice didn't buy the kind of security and independence that $57 million could provide. Nice was what you got when you were the consolation prize. As we reached our cars, Derek clapped me on the shoulder with what I'm sure he thought was brotherly affection. "Hey, don't look so glum. You got exactly what you wanted, right? A quiet place to read your books and grade your papers. No business stress, no board meetings, no difficult decisions. You can just relax and enjoy the simple life. The simple life. As if my life was simple by choice, rather than by circumstance. As if I'd deliberately chosen financial insecurity and career limitations, because I found them fulfilling." "Thanks, Derek," I managed to say. "That's very comforting." He either didn't catch the sarcasm or chose to ignore it. That's what big brothers are for. Drive safe, okay? Emma, we should grab dinner soon and talk about coordinating our inheritance strategies. There might be some tax advantages if we time things right. And just like that, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, turning his windfall into an even bigger opportunity. Derek had always been good at that, at seeing the angles and possibilities that others missed. It was one of the reasons Grandpa Harry had chosen him to run the company. I drove home to my small apartment in West Hartford, my mind churning with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. The envelope in my purse seemed to pulse with potential, but I wasn't ready to face whatever final words my grandfather had left for me. Not yet. My apartment was nothing like the homes my family lived in. It was a modest 2-bedroom in a converted Victorian house, with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that stuck when it rained. But it was mine, paid for with my own salary and my own choices. The walls were lined with bookshelves that I'd built myself, filled with everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction to the essays and poetry collections that my students sometimes inspired me to explore. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite reading chair, a worn leather armchair that I'd rescued from a yard sale and reupholstered with my own hands. The envelope sat on the side table next to me, unopened and somehow ominous. Finally, as the sun began to set outside my windows, I tore open the seal. Inside was a small brass key and a single sheet of paper. The key was old and ornate, with an intricate design that looked hand-forged. The paper contained just a few lines in my grandfather's careful script. My dearest Maya, if you're reading this, then you've heard the formal reading of my will, and you're probably feeling disappointed. Don't be. The real inheritance was never going to be announced in a restaurant full of lawyers and family members. It was always meant to be discovered by you alone, when you were ready. Take this key to the summer house. Go to the old oak tree behind the dock, the one where we used to hang the tire swing. Look for the brass plate at the base of the trunk. What you find there will explain everything. Remember what I always told you about still waters running deep. Trust yourself, Maya. You're stronger and smarter than they've ever given you credit for. All my love, Grandpa Harry. I read the note 3 times, my heart beating faster with each pass. A brass plate at the base of the oak tree. Something hidden, something meant just for me. After all the years of feeling like an afterthought in my own family, my grandfather had left me a mystery, a secret that Derek and Emma and even my parents knew nothing about. I looked at the key in my palm, its metal surface worn smooth by age and handling. Whatever it unlocked had been important enough for my grandfather to hide it, to plan this elaborate reveal that would only make sense to me. The summer house suddenly felt less like a consolation prize and more like the starting point of something I couldn't yet understand. The next morning was Saturday, and I called in sick to the weekend tutoring session I'd planned to attend. Instead, I packed an overnight bag and drove north toward New Hampshire, the brass key tucked safely in my jacket pocket. The 2-hour drive gave me time to think, to remember all the summers I'd spent at Lake Winnisquam, all the conversations I'd had with Grandpa Harry about books and dreams, and the importance of thinking for yourself. He'd always treated me differently than he'd treated Derek and Emma. Not better, necessarily, but differently. Where Derek got lectures about responsibility and market strategy, I got questions about what I was reading and what I thought about the world. Where Emma got advice about social connections and proper behavior, I got encouragement to speak my mind and trust my instincts. Still waters run deep, Maya, he used to say when I'd grown quiet during family gatherings. When Derek's confidence and Emma's charm had dominated the conversation, the loudest voices aren't always the wisest ones. I'd never understood what he meant by that, not really. But sitting in my car as the miles rolled past, heading toward whatever secret he'd left for me, I began to wonder if he'd been preparing me for something all along. The summer house looked exactly as I remembered it, though perhaps a bit more weathered around the edges. It was a modest 2-story cottage, with cedar shingles that had turned silver gray over the years, and a wraparound porch that offered views of the lake from 3 sides. The dock stretched about 30 feet into the water, its wooden planks bleached white by decades of sun and rain. And there, behind the dock, stood the old oak tree, It was massive, easily 100 years old, with a trunk so wide that it would take 3 people holding hands to circle it completely. The tire's swing was long gone, but I could still see the worn groove in the bark where the rope had hung. I walked around the base of the tree slowly, running my hands over the rough bark, looking for anything that seemed out of place. On the far side, facing away from the house, I found it. A small brass plate, about the size of a silver dollar, embedded flush with the bark. It was green with age and almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. In the center was a tiny keyhole, just the right size for the key in my pocket. My hands shook slightly as I inserted the key and turned it. There was a soft click, and the brass plate swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a small cavity carved into the living wood of the tree. Inside was a waterproof metal box, no bigger than a jewelry box. I carried it back to the house and sat on the front porch, my heart pounding. Whatever was inside this box represented my grandfather's true final gift to me. The inheritance he'd felt was too important, or too dangerous to reveal in front of the rest of the family. The box opened easily, revealing several items nestled in foam padding. A thumb drive, a small leather journal, and another envelope, this one sealed with red wax and stamped with my grandfather's initials. I opened the journal first. The pages were filled with my grandfather's handwriting, but these weren't the careful, formal letters I was used to seeing. These were quick notes, observations, records of conversations and meetings. As I read, a picture began to emerge of a man who'd been watching and listening and planning for years. There were notes about Derek's business decisions, some marked with concern or disapproval. Comments about Emma's tendency to follow rather than lead. Observations about my parents' relationship with money and status. And scattered throughout, notes about me. Maya asked intelligent questions about the quarterly report today. She sees patterns that Derek misses. Maya's instincts about the Morrison account were correct. She has better judgment than she realizes. Maya understands people in a way that will serve her well in business, if she ever chooses that path. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death. I've made my decision about the real inheritance. Maya is the only one who can be trusted with it. She has the integrity and the intelligence to use it properly. The others will never understand what I'm really leaving behind. My hands were trembling as I set the journal aside and picked up the sealed envelope. This was it, the moment that would explain everything. I broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Maya, it began. If you're reading this, then you've found the first piece of the puzzle I left for you. What I'm about to tell you will shock you, and it will probably anger you, but I need you to understand that everything I did was for a reason. The inheritance reading you attended was theater, a performance designed to protect you, and to reveal the true character of your family members. You are not the recipient of books and a summer house, Maya. You are the sole heir to the real Westfield fortune. I stopped reading and stared at the words, convinced I'd misunderstood. Sole heir to the real fortune? But Derek had inherited the company, Emma had gotten millions in investments, and I had gotten a house and some books. How could I be the sole heir to anything? I forced myself to keep reading. The company Derek inherited is profitable but heavily mortgaged. The investment accounts Emma received are real, but represent only a small fraction of my total wealth. The real money, Maya, has been hidden in offshore accounts for the past 15 years, waiting for someone I could trust to inherit it. That person is you. The letter went on to explain a financial structure so complex it made my head spin. Shell companies and trust funds and investment vehicles that I'd never heard of. But the bottom line was simple and staggering. There was over $200 million hidden in accounts around the world, and my grandfather had left it all to me. I've watched Derek over the years, the letter continued, and while he's intelligent and ambitious, he lacks the moral compass necessary to handle this kind of wealth responsibly. He would use it to build his own empire, to gain power and influence without regard for the consequences. Emma is kind but weak-willed. She would be easily manipulated by others who wanted access to the money. But you, Maya, you've always had the strength to do what's right, even when it's difficult. You've chosen a career that serves others rather than yourself. You've lived modestly and thoughtfully. You can be trusted with this responsibility. I set the letter down and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the afternoon sky like a mirror. Still waters run deep. My grandfather's favorite phrase suddenly made perfect sense. The thumb drive, when I plugged it into my laptop, contained account numbers, passwords, and contact information for a banker in the Cayman Islands named James Morrison. The same James Morrison who had called me into his office for a private meeting 3 months after the will reading, though I hadn't understood the significance at the time. I'd thought he wanted to discuss the summer house property or maybe some minor financial detail related to my inheritance. I'd had no idea that he was about to reveal the existence of accounts containing more money than I'd ever imagined. Now, sitting on the porch of my grandfather's summer house with the truth spread out before me, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. This was what Derek had dismissed as books and an old cabin. This was what my family had pitied me for receiving. The worst inheritance in family history, according to my brother. If only he knew. But as I sat there watching the sun begin to set over Lake Winnisquam, I realized that the money wasn't even the most shocking part of my grandfather's revelation. The real surprise was what it told me about my family and my place in it. All those years of feeling overlooked and undervalued, I'd been wrong about the reason. My grandfather hadn't forgotten me or dismissed me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd been watching me more carefully than anyone else, evaluating my character and my choices, preparing me for a responsibility that no one else could handle. Derek thought he'd won the lottery, but he'd actually inherited a company with limited growth potential and significant debt obligations. Emma thought she'd received a generous gift, but she'd gotten the equivalent of pocket change compared to what was really at stake. And I'd thought I'd been forgotten, when in reality I'd been chosen. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. My grandfather's letter had included specific instructions about maintaining secrecy until I was ready to reveal the truth, and I understood why. Derek would be furious when he learned that his inferior sister had inherited the real fortune. My parents would be shocked that their practical, businessman father had entrusted his life's work to a schoolteacher instead of their ambitious son. Emma would probably be hurt that she hadn't been trusted with the secret, but for now, they didn't need to know. For now, I could take my time processing this revelation, planning how to use this unexpected power responsibly. My grandfather had trusted me with more than money. He'd trusted me with the power to change lives, to support causes I believed in, to make a real difference in the world. As I locked up the summer house and prepared to drive back to Hartford, I thought about Derek's smug satisfaction at the will reading, his certainty that he'd gotten the best inheritance while I'd been stuck with the scraps. He'd have months or even years to enjoy that delusion, depending on how and when I chose to reveal the truth. The irony was almost perfect. Derek had always been the one who looked for angles and opportunities, who prided himself on seeing what others missed. But this time, he'd missed the biggest opportunity of all. He'd been so focused on the obvious symbols of wealth and power that he'd completely overlooked the still waters running deep right beside him. My phone buzzed as I merged onto the highway, a text from Emma asking how the summer house looked and whether I was planning to keep it. I smiled as I typed back a simple response. It's perfect. I'm definitely keeping it. Perfect didn't begin to cover it. But Emma would understand eventually, when the time was right to share the whole truth. For now, it was enough to know that my grandfather had seen something in me that I'd never seen in myself. Something worth more than all of Derek's business degrees and networking connections combined. I drove home through the gathering darkness, my mind already spinning with possibilities and plans. The books and the old cabin that Derek had mocked would become the foundation for something bigger and more important than he could imagine. And when the time came to reveal what I'd really inherited, I wanted to be ready. Still waters, after all, run very deep indeed. The Monday morning after my trip to New Hampshire arrived with an October chill that seemed to seep through my apartment windows and settle in my bones. I sat at my small kitchen table, nursing my second cup of coffee and staring at the thumb drive that contained enough financial information to rewrite my family's entire understanding of wealth and power. The brass key lay beside it, catching the weak sunlight that filtered through my gauze curtains. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Derek's smug face at the will reading, heard his condescending comments about books and old cabins. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. While he'd been calculating how quickly he could modernize Westfield Industries and maximize profits, I'd been sitting on information that made his inheritance look like pocket change. But knowledge without a plan was just potential energy waiting to be released. My grandfather hadn't entrusted me with $200 million so I could gloat over my brother's ignorance. He'd chosen me because he believed I would use this responsibility wisely. And that meant I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. I opened my laptop and carefully inserted the thumb drive, my heart rate picking up as files began to populate on the screen. Account numbers, routing codes, investment summaries, and contact information for financial institutions I'd only heard about in movies. The Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Singapore. My grandfather had scattered his real wealth across the globe like seeds in a carefully tended garden. The documentation was meticulous, organized in folders by country and institution. Each account had detailed records showing deposits, withdrawals, and growth over the past 15 years. Some of the numbers made me dizzy. A single investment account in Geneva contained $43 million. A trust fund in the Caymans held $37 million. Real estate holdings in London and Dubai were valued at over $50 million combined. But what struck me most wasn't the size of the fortune. It was the pattern of activity. My grandfather hadn't just hidden this money and forgotten about it. He'd been actively managing it, moving funds between accounts, reinvesting profits, and making strategic decisions right up until his final illness. This wasn't a passive inheritance sitting in dusty bank vaults. This was a living, breathing financial empire that required constant attention and expertise. The scope of it terrified me. I was a high school English teacher who balanced her checkbook on a smartphone app and considered $1,000 in savings a major accomplishment. How was I supposed to manage investments worth more than the gross domestic product of small countries? That's when I found the second folder on the thumb drive, labeled simply Team. Inside were profiles and contact information for a network of financial advisors, lawyers, and specialists who had been working with my grandfather for years. These weren't random recommendations. They were carefully vetted professionals who already knew about the offshore accounts and had been managing them under my grandfather's direction. The first name on the list was James Morrison, the banker from First National who had called me for that mysterious meeting. Below his contact information was a note in my grandfather's handwriting. James has been my primary coordinator for the past 8 years. He understands the full scope of the holdings and has been expecting your call. He will help you transition into active management when you're ready. I stared at the phone number, my thumb hovering over the screen. This was the moment of no return. Once I called James Morrison and acknowledged what I'd inherited, there would be no going back to my simple life of grading papers and worrying about rent. But there would also be no more wondering what my grandfather had really thought of me. No more accepting Derek's assumptions about my worth and capabilities. I dialed the number. First National Wealth Management, James Morrison speaking. His voice was warm and professional, with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't quite place. British, maybe, or Australian. Mr. Morrison, this is Maya Chen. I believe you've been expecting my call. There was a pause, then what sounded like a quiet sigh of relief. Maya, yes, indeed. I was beginning to wonder if you'd found Harold's message. How are you handling the revelation? The directness of his question caught me off guard. No small talk, no pretense. He already knew exactly why I was calling and what I'd discovered. I'm still processing it, I admitted. It's a lot to take in. I imagine it is. Harold spoke about you often over the years. He was very proud of the woman you'd become, though I suspect he never told you that directly. My throat tightened unexpectedly. He didn't. That was his way. Harold believed that genuine confidence had to come from within, not from external validation. He watched you build a life based on your own values and choices, without the influence of family money or expectations. That's why he trusted you with this responsibility. I walked to my living room window, looking down at the quiet street below. A few neighbors were heading to work, coffee cups in hand, probably worrying about ordinary things like traffic and meetings and what to make for dinner. I envied them their normal concerns. Mr. Morrison, I need to be honest with you. I don't know anything about managing this kind of wealth. I'm not sure I'm qualified for this responsibility. Call me James, please. And qualifications aren't just about financial knowledge, Maya. They're about character, judgment, and the ability to think beyond your own immediate interests. Your grandfather spent years observing how you and your siblings handled smaller challenges. Derek may understand profit margins, but Harold watched him fire 3 employees last year to boost quarterly numbers, even though the company was performing well. Emma may be charming at social events, but Harold noticed that her charitable interests always seemed to align with whatever cause was trendy among her social circle. His words stung because they rang true. Derek had always been ruthless about efficiency, and Emma had always been more concerned with appearance than substance. But I'd never thought of these traits as disqualifying character flaws. They were just part of who my siblings were. What about the legal aspects? I asked. Derek inherited controlling interest in Westfield Industries. Won't there be conflicts if I'm managing a separate fortune that's larger than the company itself? James chuckled softly. Harold anticipated that question. Legally, there's no conflict at all. Derek inherited what Harold wanted him to inherit, and you inherited what Harold wanted you to inherit. The offshore holdings are completely separate from Westfield Industries. Derek has no claim to them. And more importantly, he has no knowledge of them. But eventually he'll find out, won't he? I can't hide this forever. You don't have to hide it forever, Maya. But you don't have to reveal it immediately either. Harold's instructions were very clear on this point. You should take whatever time you need to understand your inheritance and develop your own plans for it. When and how you choose to inform your family is entirely up to you. We talked for another 20 minutes. Covering the basics of account access and management procedures. James explained that I could start small, reviewing monthly statements and learning about the various investments before taking on more active decision-making responsibilities. He also mentioned that Harold had established a small discretionary fund, about $5 million, that I could access immediately for personal use or charitable giving while I figured out the bigger picture. $5 million as a discretionary fund. The amount was so absurd that I almost laughed. That was more money than I would earn in my entire teaching career, and my grandfather had considered it pocket change for getting started. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment for a long time, trying to wrap my mind around my new reality. This morning I'd been Maya Chen, high school English teacher with a modest savings account and a used Honda Civic. Now I was Maya Chen, secret multimillionaire with a global financial empire and enough resources to change lives on a massive scale. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Hope you're settling in okay after yesterday. Want to grab lunch this week and catch up? I stared at the message, wondering what Emma would think if she knew that her big sister was now worth more than 10 times her own inheritance. Would she be happy for me? Jealous? Confused about why Grandpa Harry had chosen me over her? I typed back a simple response. Sure, lunch sounds great. How about Wednesday? Wednesday would give me 2 days to process everything and decide how much, if anything, I wanted to share with Emma. She'd always been the sibling I was closest to, but she was also the most likely to accidentally reveal information to Derek or our parents. Emma had never been good at keeping secrets, especially exciting ones. The next 2 days passed in a blur of research and planning. I spent hours reading about offshore banking, investment strategies, and wealth management. I researched the financial advisors and lawyers on my grandfather's team, looking up their credentials and track records. I even started a notebook, documenting questions and ideas as they occurred to me. The most surprising discovery was how much my grandfather had been giving away. Hidden in the financial records were regular donations to dozens of charities and nonprofit organizations, educational scholarships, medical research, disaster relief, environmental conservation. He'd been quietly funding causes all over the world, often in amounts that represented significant portions of an organization's annual budget. This wasn't the grandfather I'd known growing up. The Harold Westfield of family dinners and holiday gatherings had been practical and conservative. Someone who believed in hard work and personal responsibility, but rarely talked about broader social issues. This secret version of him had been using his wealth to tackle poverty, disease, and injustice on a global scale. I found myself wondering if this was part of what he'd wanted me to continue. The note he'd left hadn't mentioned specific instructions for the money, but the pattern of his giving suggested a man who believed that great wealth came with great responsibility. Maybe that was the real test he'd left for me, not just managing the money, but figuring out how to use it in ways that honored his values while reflecting my own. Wednesday afternoon found me sitting across from Emma at the Lighthouse Cafe, a trendy spot downtown that served overpriced salads and artisanal coffee. Emma had chosen the location, and I suspected it was because she wanted to be seen. She'd always been conscious of image and status in ways that I'd never fully understood. She looked polished as always, her auburn hair styled in loose waves, and her makeup perfectly applied despite the fact that it was the middle of the week. Her cream-colored blouse probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, and her handbag was the kind of designer accessory that I recognized from magazine advertisements. "You look good," she said as we settled into our seats. "Relaxed. The summer house must have agreed with you." I smiled, thinking about how drastically my life had changed since my weekend trip to New Hampshire. It was exactly what I needed. Quiet and peaceful. "I'm glad. I was worried about you after the will reading. Derek can be such an ass sometimes, but you know he doesn't mean anything by it. He just gets excited about business opportunities." This was typical Emma, making excuses for Derek's behavior while simultaneously acknowledging that it was problematic. She'd been doing this our entire lives, smoothing over conflicts and trying to maintain family harmony, even when harmony wasn't possible or healthy. "I'm not worried about Derek," I said, which was true in a way he could never imagine. "I'm actually pretty happy with how things turned out." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Really? I mean, I know you love books and the summer house has sentimental value, but aren't you a little disappointed about the financial side of things? $50,000 for maintenance isn't exactly substantial." I sipped my coffee, choosing my words carefully. "Money isn't everything, Em. Grandpa Harry knew what would make me happy." "That's very mature of you," she said, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I just think it's unfair that Derek got so much more. You're every bit as smart as he is, probably smarter in some ways. You should have gotten an equal share." Her loyalty touched me, even though she had no idea how misplaced her concern was. Emma had always stood up for me when she thought I was being treated unfairly, even when it put her in an awkward position with Derek or our parents. "What are you planning to do with your inheritance?" I asked, changing the subject away from my own situation. Emma's face lit up. "Actually, I'm really excited about the educational trusts. I've been researching different scholarship programs and literacy initiatives. There's so much good we could do with that money, Maya. I'm thinking about setting up partnerships with schools in underserved communities, maybe funding teacher training programs, or providing resources for students who can't afford college prep courses." As she talked, I could see the genuine enthusiasm in her eyes. This wasn't Emma trying to impress anyone or following the latest social trend. This was Emma passionate about making a real difference, even if she was working with a fraction of the resources that were now at my disposal. An idea began forming in my mind. What if I didn't have to choose between keeping my inheritance secret and helping the people I cared about? What if there was a way to support Emma's charitable work without revealing the full scope of what I'd inherited? "That sounds amazing," I said. "Have you thought about starting your own foundation, or would you work through existing organizations?" "I'm not sure yet. Starting a foundation seems complicated, and I don't really have experience with that kind of thing. I was thinking maybe I'd partner with established nonprofits, at least at first." "What if you had more resources to work with?" I asked carefully. "Hypothetically, I mean. What could you accomplish if you had a bigger budget?" Emma's eyes widened. "Oh, Maya, so much more. We could fund entire school districts, provide free college tuition for hundreds of students, train thousands of teachers. With enough money, we could actually move the needle on educational inequality, instead of just making small dents. Her passion was infectious, and I found myself imagining what we could accomplish working together. Emma had the connections and the social skills to build partnerships and navigate bureaucratic challenges. I had the resources to fund ambitious projects on a scale that could create lasting change. Together, we might be able to honor Grandpa Harry's legacy while building something entirely new. But first, I needed to understand more about the family dynamics that had shaped my grandfather's decisions. Emma, can I ask you something? Did you ever feel like Grandpa Harry treated us differently? Not better or worse, just differently? She paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? I mean, Derek always got the business mentorship, and you got the social guidance, and I got the quiet conversations about books and ideas. Did you ever wonder why he divided his attention that way? Emma set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, considering the question. I guess I always assumed he was just connecting with us based on our interests. Derek loves business, so they talked business. You love literature, so you discussed books. I love people and events, so he taught me about networking and social responsibility. But what if it was more than that? What if he was evaluating us somehow? Evaluating us for what? I hesitated, not sure how much I wanted to reveal. I found some things at the summer house. Papers, notes. It looks like Grandpa Harry was paying more attention to our choices and character than any of us realized. Emma leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of notes? Observations about how we handled different situations. Comments about our values and priorities. It's like he was keeping track of who we were becoming as adults. That's kind of creepy, Emma said. But she didn't sound upset, just curious. What did he say about us? He was proud of your kindness and your instinct to help people. But he was worried that you might be too influenced by what other people thought, that you might make decisions based on social pressure rather than your own convictions. Emma was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. And Derek? He respected Derek's intelligence and drive, but he was concerned about his lack of empathy. He thought Derek saw people as resources to be managed, rather than individuals with their own worth. What about you? I smiled. He thought I was stronger than I realized, more capable of independent thinking and moral leadership than I gave myself credit for. He was right about that, Emma said softly. You've always been the one who stood up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. Remember in high school, when you got suspended for organizing that protest about the dress code? Mom and Dad were furious, but you didn't back down because you believed the policy was discriminatory. I'd forgotten about that incident, but Emma was right. I'd spent 3 days in detention because I'd convinced half the senior class to wear identical outfits that technically violated the school's guidelines about distracting clothing. The administration had eventually revised the dress code, but not before threatening to put a disciplinary note in my permanent record. I can't believe you remember that. Of course I remember. Derek called you an idiot for risking your college applications over something so trivial, but I thought it was brave. You saw something that was wrong, and you did something about it, even though it cost you. Her words hit me harder than I'd expected. Maybe my grandfather had been right about my character, and maybe Emma saw it too. If that was true, then perhaps I was more ready for the responsibility of managing his fortune than I'd thought. We finished lunch with plans to meet again the following week, and I promised to show Emma some of the notes I'd found at the summer house. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a step toward including her in whatever came next. That evening, I called James Morrison from the privacy of my apartment. I've been thinking about my grandfather's charitable giving, I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. I'd like to understand more about his priorities and methods. Harold was very strategic about his philanthropy, James replied. He believed in funding systemic change rather than just addressing symptoms. Education, healthcare access, economic development in underserved communities. He also preferred to work behind the scenes, providing significant funding to organizations that were already doing good work, rather than starting his own initiatives. What if I wanted to expand on that approach? Maybe work with a partner who understands the social and political landscape better than I do? That's very wise, Maya. Effective philanthropy requires more than just money. It requires knowledge, connections, and credibility within the communities you're trying to serve. Do you have someone in mind? I thought about Emma's passionate description of her educational reform ideas, her natural ability to connect with people from all backgrounds, her genuine desire to make a difference. I might. But I'd want to start small, test the partnership before committing to anything major. Of course. Might I suggest beginning with one of Harold's existing charitable relationships? There's a literacy program in Hartford that he's been supporting for several years. They're well managed and have a strong track record, but they're always in need of additional funding. It might be an ideal place to start. We discussed the details, and by the end of the conversation, I had a plan. I would make an anonymous donation to the Hartford Literacy Initiative, enough to fund their operations for the next 2 years, and allow them to expand their programming. Then I would encourage Emma to get involved with the organization, maybe even suggest that she consider joining their board of directors. It wouldn't reveal my inheritance, but it would give me a way to start using the money responsibly while testing whether Emma and I could work together effectively. If the partnership succeeded, I could gradually increase my involvement and eventually bring her into the bigger picture. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since the will reading, I wasn't thinking about what Derek had gotten or what I'd missed out on. I was thinking about what I could build, what problems I could solve, what kind of legacy I wanted to create. I spent the day researching the Hartford Literacy Initiative, learning about their programs and their leadership. They provided free tutoring and educational support to children and adults in low-income neighborhoods, exactly the kind of grassroots work that could benefit from increased funding and community partnerships. Their website featured testimonials from students who had learned to read as adults, high school dropouts who had earned their GEDs, and parents who had been able to help their children with homework for the first time. These were the kinds of individual success stories that reflected broader social progress, the kind of work that my grandfather had quietly supported for years. By Friday afternoon, I had transferred $100,000 from the discretionary fund to the Hartford Literacy Initiative. It was more money than they typically received in an entire year, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to what I could eventually provide. The donation would remain anonymous, but I made sure to mention that I'd heard about their work through Emma Chen, who was interested in educational initiatives. With any luck, they would reach out to her directly, creating a natural opportunity for her to get involved. My phone rang just as I was finishing the transfer paperwork. Derek's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won out. "Hey Maya, how's the teaching life treating you?" His tone was casual, almost friendly, which immediately put me on guard. Derek never called just to chat, especially not with me. "It's fine, Derek. What's up?" I was actually calling about the summer house. I've been thinking about family assets and long-term planning, and I wanted to run something by you. Here it comes, I thought. Derek had probably been researching the property value and had decided that I didn't deserve to own lakefront real estate in New Hampshire. What about it? Well, the thing is, maintaining a property like that is expensive. Upkeep, taxes, winterization, insurance. Grandpa left you $50,000 for maintenance, but that's not going to last very long. I was thinking maybe we could work out an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I could take over the property management responsibilities, handle all the maintenance and expenses, maybe even do some renovations to increase the value. In exchange, the family could use it as a vacation home, and when you're ready to sell, we'd split the proceeds. It would take the financial burden off you while ensuring that the property stays in the family. I had to admire his audacity. Derek was essentially offering to take control of my inheritance while making it sound like he was doing me a favor. He'd probably convinced himself that this was a generous solution that would benefit everyone, when in reality it was just another way for him to expand his own portfolio. That's very thoughtful of you, Derek, but I'm planning to keep the house. Are you sure? I mean, be realistic, Maya. You're a teacher. You can't afford to maintain a property like that on your salary. and you certainly can't afford to lose money on it if something major goes wrong. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Poor little Maya, too naive and financially irresponsible to handle a simple real estate investment. If only he knew that I was currently managing a portfolio that made his inheritance look like a child's allowance. I appreciate your concern, but I've got it handled. How? Did you take out a loan against the property? Because that could be risky if you can't make the payments. His persistence was starting to annoy me. Derek couldn't accept that I might be capable of managing my own affairs, even something as basic as owning a summer house. Derek, I said I've got it handled. The house is mine, and I'm keeping it. End of discussion. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from condescending to irritated. Fine, but don't come crying to me when you're facing foreclosure or bankruptcy because you were too stubborn to accept help. I won't, I said calmly, and hung up. I sat staring at my phone, feeling a mixture of anger and amusement. Derek was so convinced of his own superiority that he couldn't imagine a scenario where I might have resources or capabilities that he didn't know about. His worldview required me to be the struggling younger sister who needed his guidance and protection. Well, he was about to learn that worldviews could be dangerously inaccurate. That weekend, I drove back up to New Hampshire to spend some time at the summer house. I needed space to think and plan, away from the family dynamics and expectations that had shaped so much of my life. The October foliage was at its peak, painting the landscape in shades of red, orange, and gold that looked almost artificial in their intensity. The house felt different now that I knew its true significance. It wasn't just a nostalgic retreat or a modest consolation prize. It was the first piece of a much larger puzzle. The place where my grandfather had chosen to reveal the truth about what he really thought of me and what he really wanted me to do with his legacy. I spent Saturday morning sitting on the dock, watching the lake reflect the brilliant autumn sky, while I made lists of possibilities and priorities. Education seemed like the obvious starting point, given both Emma's interests and my own background as a teacher. But there were so many other areas where strategic funding could make a difference. Healthcare, environmental conservation, economic development, criminal justice reform. The scope of potential impact was overwhelming, but also energizing. For the first time in my adult life, I had the resources to turn ideas into action, to support causes I cared about, without worrying about personal financial constraints. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. The Hartford Literacy Initiative called me. They want to meet about joining their board. Did you mention me to them somehow? I smiled as I typed back. I may have suggested they could benefit from your expertise. Congratulations. It was a small first step, but it felt significant. Emma would bring her passion and social skills to an organization that I could support financially, creating a partnership that neither of us could achieve alone. And if this experiment worked, it could become the model for much larger collaborations. By Sunday evening, I had filled an entire notebook with ideas and preliminary plans. I'd also made a decision about Derek and his unwelcome advice regarding the summer house. If he wanted to keep underestimating me, that was his choice. But I wasn't going to waste energy being frustrated by his assumptions or trying to change his mind. Derek would learn the truth about my inheritance eventually, but it would be on my terms and in my timing. Until then, I was perfectly content to let him believe that his bookish little sister was struggling to maintain an old cabin while he built his business empire. Still waters, as my grandfather used to say, run very deep indeed. The drive back to Hartford gave me time to process everything that had happened over the past week. 7 days ago, I'd been a high school teacher with a modest inheritance and a family that consistently undervalued her contributions. Now I was the secret heir to a massive fortune, with the power to influence causes and organizations around the world. The transformation was so dramatic that it felt almost fictional, like something that happened to characters in the novels I taught to my students. But the weight of the car keys in my pocket and the taste of lake water still lingering in my memory proved that this was real. As I merged onto I-95 and headed south toward home, I found myself thinking about my students and what they would make of this story if they knew about it. Would they see it as a fairy tale, a triumph of good over evil, or would they recognize the more complex themes of family loyalty, moral responsibility, and the corrupting potential of wealth and power? Maybe that would be a good way to frame my own thinking about the inheritance. Not as a windfall or a burden, but as a character development opportunity. What kind of person did I want to become now that I had these resources? How could I use this power responsibly while staying true to the values that had earned my grandfather's trust in the first place? The answers wouldn't come quickly or easily, but I had time to figure them out. Derek might be eager to revolutionize Westfield Industries and maximize profits, but I could afford to be more thoughtful and deliberate about my choices. After all, the best stories were never about the destination. They were about the journey and the person you became along the way. The call came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, while I was grading essays about the Great Gatsby and drinking my first cup of coffee. Emma's voice was breathless with excitement, and I could hear the smile in her words even through the phone. Maya, you're not going to believe this. The Hartford Literacy Initiative just offered me a position on their board of directors, and they want to discuss a major expansion of their programming. Apparently, they received an enormous anonymous donation last week, enough to fund their operations for the next 2 years and launch 3 new community centers. I set down my red pen and leaned back in my kitchen chair, fighting to keep my voice neutral. That's wonderful, Em. You must be thrilled. I am, but it's also terrifying. They want me to help design the expansion strategy and oversee the implementation. This is exactly the kind of work I've always dreamed of doing, but what if I mess it up? What if I'm not qualified enough? The vulnerability in her voice reminded me of the Emma I'd grown up with. The little sister who'd always been harder on herself than anyone else despite her natural talents and social skills. Our parents had spent so much time praising Derek's achievements and managing my supposed shortcomings that Emma's quiet competence had often gone unnoticed. You're absolutely qualified, I said firmly. You have a degree in social work, years of volunteer experience, and more importantly, you genuinely care about the cause. That combination is exactly what they need. You really think so? I know so. When do you start? Next Monday. They want me to attend their weekly staff meeting and then spend the afternoon touring the existing facilities. Maya, what if this is my chance to actually make a difference? What if I could help break the cycle of educational inequality for hundreds of families? Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling as I listened to her plans and dreams. This was exactly what I'd hoped would happen when I'd made the anonymous donation. Emma had found her calling, and I'd found a way to support important work without revealing my own involvement. I think Grandpa Harry would be proud of you, I said, and meant it. I hope so. I keep thinking about what you said last week, about him keeping notes on our character and choices. Maybe this is my chance to prove that his faith in me wasn't misplaced. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the ripple effects that were already starting to spread from my decision to start using the inheritance. Emma's career was about to take a dramatic turn for the better. Hundreds of families would have access to educational resources they'd never had before, and I was learning how to wield significant financial power in ways that created positive change. But I was also beginning to understand the isolation that came with secret wealth. Every conversation with my family now carried an undercurrent of deception. I couldn't share Emma's excitement without revealing my own role in creating her opportunity. I couldn't tell my parents about the fascinating financial strategies I was learning without explaining why I suddenly had access to that kind of information. And I certainly couldn't tell Derek that his dismissive comments about my inheritance were becoming more ironic by the day. The weight of maintaining the secret was heavier than I'd expected, but so was the responsibility of managing resources that could change lives. James Morrison had been right when he'd warned me that wealth of this magnitude came with complex ethical and practical challenges. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Chen, this is Dr. Sarah Rodriguez from the law firm of Rodriguez, Kim & Associates. James Morrison suggested I contact you regarding estate planning and charitable giving strategies. Would you be available for a consultation this week? I stared at the message, my heart rate picking up slightly. This was another member of my grandfather's professional team, reaching out as I transitioned into active management of the inheritance. Each new contact represented another step away from my old life, and deeper into a world I was still learning to navigate. I called the number, and Dr. Rodriguez answered on the second ring. Her voice was crisp and professional, with the kind of confidence that came from years of handling complex legal matters. Ms. Chen, thank you for calling. I understand you're beginning to take a more active role in managing your grandfather's charitable giving. I'd like to discuss some strategies that could maximize the impact of your donations while providing significant tax advantages. We scheduled a meeting for Thursday afternoon at her offices in downtown Hartford. As I wrote the appointment in my calendar, I realized that my schedule was gradually filling up with meetings and responsibilities that had nothing to do with teaching. Investment reviews with James Morrison, legal consultations with Dr. Rodriguez, research into potential charitable partners and grant recipients. I was becoming someone I'd never imagined being. A philanthropist with the resources to fund major initiatives and the growing knowledge to make those investments strategically. The transformation was exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. That afternoon, I received an email that changed the trajectory of my week completely. The subject line read, Westfield Industries Quarterly Report, and the sender was Derek's assistant at the company headquarters. I almost deleted it automatically, assuming it was some kind of mistake. I'd never received corporate communications from Westfield Industries before, and I certainly wasn't involved in the company's operations. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the attachment. The quarterly report was exactly what I'd expected. Dense financial tables, performance metrics, and strategic projections that meant little to someone without business training. But as I scrolled through the document, one section caught my attention. Under major capital expenditures, there was a line item for executive compensation restructuring, totaling $3 million. That seemed like an enormous amount for restructuring compensation, especially for a company that employed fewer than 200 people. I kept reading and found another curious entry under consulting fees, $1. $8 million paid to something called Chen Strategic Development, LLC. I'd never heard of Chen Strategic Development, but the name was obviously connected to our family. A quick internet search revealed that it was a consulting firm registered in Delaware just 3 months ago, with Derek listed as the managing partner. The implications were disturbing. Derek had inherited controlling interest in Westfield Industries, and within months of taking over, he'd restructured executive compensation to benefit himself and created a consulting company that was billing the family business nearly $2 million for unspecified services. This might have been perfectly legal, but it felt ethically questionable at best. Derek was essentially using his position as the majority shareholder to funnel money from the company into his own pockets through multiple channels. The employees whose jobs my grandfather had wanted to protect were unknowingly subsidizing Derek's personal wealth accumulation. After all the years of feeling like an afterthought in my own family, my grandfather had left me a mystery, a secret that Derek and Emma and even my parents knew nothing about. I looked at the key in my palm, its metal surface worn smooth by age and handling. Whatever it unlocked had been important enough for my grandfather to hide it, to plan this elaborate reveal that would only make sense to me. The summer house suddenly felt less like a consolation prize and more like the starting point of something I couldn't yet understand. The next morning was Saturday, and I called in sick to the weekend tutoring session I'd planned to attend. Instead, I packed an overnight bag and drove north toward New Hampshire, the brass key tucked safely in my jacket pocket. The 2-hour drive gave me time to think, to remember all the summers I'd spent at Lake Winnisquam, all the conversations I'd had with Grandpa Harry about books and dreams, and the importance of thinking for yourself. He'd always treated me differently than he'd treated Derek and Emma. Not better, necessarily, but differently. Where Derek got lectures about responsibility and market strategy, I got questions about what I was reading and what I thought about the world. Where Emma got advice about social connections and proper behavior, I got encouragement to speak my mind and trust my instincts. Still waters run deep, Maya, he used to say when I'd grown quiet during family gatherings. When Derek's confidence and Emma's charm had dominated the conversation, the loudest voices aren't always the wisest ones. I'd never understood what he meant by that, not really. But sitting in my car as the miles rolled past, heading toward whatever secret he'd left for me, I began to wonder if he'd been preparing me for something all along. The summer house looked exactly as I remembered it, though perhaps a bit more weathered around the edges. It was a modest 2-story cottage, with cedar shingles that had turned silver gray over the years, and a wraparound porch that offered views of the lake from 3 sides. The dock stretched about 30 feet into the water, its wooden planks bleached white by decades of sun and rain. And there, behind the dock, stood the old oak tree. It was massive, easily 100 years old, with a trunk so wide that it would take 3 people holding hands to circle it completely. The tire's swing was long gone, but I could still see the worn groove in the bark where the rope had hung. He felt that teaching was one of the most important professions in society, even though it was often undervalued financially. The comment surprised me. I had always assumed that my grandfather saw my career choice as a pleasant but impractical indulgence, something I'd eventually outgrow when I got serious about building wealth and status. He never told me that, I admitted. Harold wasn't given to effusive praise, but he respected people who chose service over personal gain. That's one of the reasons he trusted you with this inheritance. He knew you wouldn't use it purely for your own benefit. She opened a thick folder and spread several documents across the table. James has briefed me on your interest in expanding your charitable giving. I'd like to discuss some strategies that could help you maximize your impact while maintaining the privacy and flexibility you'll need as you develop your philanthropic priorities. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Rodriguez walked me through the complex world of charitable foundations, donor-advised funds, and tax-efficient giving strategies. The information was overwhelming but fascinating, revealing a sophisticated ecosystem designed to help wealthy individuals channel their resources toward social good. One option that might appeal to you, she said, is establishing a private foundation focused on educational initiatives. You could work with partners like your sister Emma to identify and fund promising programs, while maintaining ultimate control over the foundation's direction and priorities. The idea of working openly with Emma was appealing, but it would require revealing at least part of my inheritance. I wasn't ready for that level of disclosure yet, not until I better understood the family dynamics and potential consequences. What about anonymous giving? I asked. Is there a way to provide significant funding without revealing the source? Absolutely. Donor-advised funds allow you to make charitable contributions while maintaining complete anonymity. You can even work through intermediaries to identify and evaluate potential recipients, so there's no direct connection between you and the organizations you support. As we discussed the technical details, I mentioned the Westfield Industries quarterly report and asked for her opinion about Derek's compensation arrangements. Dr. Rodriguez reviewed the documents with the focused attention of someone trained to spot potential problems. After several minutes, she looked up with a slight frown. The consulting fees are concerning, she said. It's legal for a majority shareholder to contract with their own company, but the amounts seem excessive for a business of this size. More problematically, there's no clear documentation of what services Chen Strategic Development is actually providing. What does that mean in practical terms? It could mean that Derek is essentially paying himself consulting fees for work that should be part of his regular executive duties. If that's the case, he might be violating his fiduciary responsibility to the minority shareholders and potentially exposing the company to legal liability. The minority shareholders. In all my focus on Derek's ethics and my grandfather's intentions, I'd forgotten that other people owned pieces of Westfield Industries. Employees with stock options, outside investors who'd believed in the company's long-term potential, maybe even family friends who'd been offered opportunities to participate in the business over the years. Derek's financial maneuvering wasn't just questionable in abstract terms. It was potentially harming real people who'd trusted him to manage the company responsibly. What would you recommend? I asked. That depends on your goals. If you simply want to protect your family's reputation, you could have a quiet conversation with Derek about the optics of these arrangements. If you're concerned about the legal and ethical implications, you could request a formal audit of the consulting relationship. If you want to take more direct action, you could explore whether you have any legal standing to challenge his management decisions. Legal standing. I was just Derek's sister, with no ownership stake in Westfield Industries and no official role in the company's operations. What kind of legal standing could I possibly have? But even as I thought it, I realized that my situation was more complex than that. The offshore accounts contained investments in dozens of companies and financial instruments around the world. It was entirely possible that some of those holdings intersected with Westfield Industries in ways I didn't yet understand. Dr. Rodriguez, would it be possible for you to research whether any of my grandfather's offshore investments have connections to Westfield Industries? I'd like to understand the full scope of my potential interests before deciding how to proceed. She made a note in her legal pad. Of course. I'll coordinate with James Morrison to review your portfolio for any relationships to the family business. That analysis should be complete within a week. As I prepared to leave, Dr. Rodriguez handed me a business card and a thick packet of information about charitable foundations and giving strategies. Take your time reviewing these materials, she said. Effective philanthropy requires careful planning and thoughtful execution. Your grandfather spent years developing his approach, and you should feel free to take whatever time you need to develop your own. The drive back to West Hartford gave me time to process everything I'd learned. In just one meeting, my understanding of the inheritance had expanded to include potential conflicts with Derek's business practices, legal strategies for charitable giving, and the possibility that my grandfather's investments were more interconnected with family affairs than I'd realized. The complexity was daunting, but so was the growing sense that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My grandfather had chosen me for this responsibility not despite my lack of business experience, but because of my different perspective and values. He'd wanted someone who would ask ethical questions, consider the impact on other people, and prioritize long-term good over short-term profit. That evening, I called Emma to check on her first day with the Hartford Literacy Initiative. Maya, it was incredible, she said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. The staff is so dedicated, and the students are amazing. I met a woman named Maria who learned to read at age 43 so she could help her daughter with homework. I met a teenager named Marcus who's using the tutoring program to prepare for his SATs after dropping out of high school 2 years ago. As she described her day, I could hear the passion and purpose in her voice. This wasn't just a job for Emma. It was a calling, a chance to use her natural empathy and social skills to make a real difference in people's lives. The best part, she continued, is that they want me to help design a new mentorship program that connects successful professionals with adult learners. The idea is to provide not just educational support, but also career guidance and networking opportunities. The mentorship program sounded exactly like something my grandfather would have supported, an initiative that addressed both immediate needs and systemic barriers to economic mobility. That sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do, I said. I hope so. Maya, I keep thinking about what you said about Grandpa Harry's notes. Do you think he would have approved of this career change? I know he always expected me to focus on traditional social activities and charitable fundraising. The question struck me as deeply sad. Emma was 38 years old, professionally accomplished, and passionate about meaningful work, but she was still seeking approval from a grandfather who died months ago and parents who'd never fully appreciated her potential. I think Grandpa Harry would have been thrilled to see you using your talents to help people improve their lives. That's exactly the kind of values-driven work he respected most. Really? How do you know? I hesitated, wanting to share more about what I'd discovered, but still not ready to reveal the full truth. I spent a lot of time talking with him before he died, and he often mentioned how proud he was of your compassion and your ability to connect with people from all backgrounds. He thought those were rare and valuable qualities. He said that about me? He did. Emma, you don't need anyone else's approval to know that your work is important. You're helping people gain the literacy skills they need to improve their lives and their children's futures. That's as meaningful as any career could possibly be. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment thinking about the different paths my siblings and I had taken since the inheritance. Derek was consolidating power and maximizing his financial returns, potentially at the expense of other people's interests. Emma was channeling her energy into work that served vulnerable populations, even though it would never make her wealthy or famous. And I was learning to wield significant resources behind the scenes, trying to support causes I believed in while maintaining the privacy I needed to operate effectively. 3 different approaches to success and responsibility, shaped by 3 different value systems and 3 different understandings of what mattered most in life. My phone buzzed with an email from James Morrison. Maya, I have some information that might interest you regarding Westfield Industries and your portfolio holdings. Could we schedule a call for tomorrow morning? I stared at the message, my heart rate picking up. Dr. Rodriguez had said it would take a week to research potential connections between my inheritance and the family business, but James had apparently found something significant enough to warrant immediate discussion. Whatever he'd discovered, I had a feeling it was going to change everything about my relationship with Derek and my approach to managing the inheritance. The quiet phase of my transformation was about to end, and the strategic phase was about to begin. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my reading chair with the packet of information Drive Rodriguez had given me about charitable foundations. If I was going to start wielding real power in my family's affairs, I needed to understand all my options and their potential consequences. Outside my window, the October evening was clear and cool, with stars visible despite the city lights. It was the kind of night that invited contemplation and planning, the kind of night when important decisions crystallized into action. By the time I went to bed, I'd filled several pages with notes about foundation structures, giving strategies, and potential areas of focus for my philanthropic work. But I'd also made a more immediate decision about Derek and his questionable business practices. If my grandfather's investments were connected to Westfield Industries in ways that gave me legal standing to challenge Derek's management, I was going to use that leverage. Not out of spite or revenge, but out of responsibility to the employees, minority shareholders, and business partners who deserved ethical leadership. Derek had spent months assuming that I was too naive and financially unsophisticated to pose any threat to his plans. He'd dismissed my inheritance as insignificant and treated me like a child who needed his guidance and protection. Tomorrow morning's call with James Morrison would determine whether Derek's assumptions were about to cost him everything he thought he'd gained. The irony was almost perfect. Derek had inherited the family business because my grandfather believed he had the intelligence and drive to run it successfully. But Derek's lack of ethical grounding, the very character flaw that had concerned my grandfather, was about to give me the justification I needed to intervene in his management of the company. Still waters, I thought, as I turned off the lights, run deeper than anyone imagines. James Morrison's voice carried an undercurrent of excitement that I'd never heard before when he called at exactly 9 o'clock Friday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the Hartford Courier spread open to an article about local literacy programs, though I couldn't concentrate on the words. Maya, I have some rather remarkable news about your portfolio's intersection with Westfield Industries. Are you somewhere private where we can speak freely? I glanced around my empty apartment, then walked to the window to ensure my neighbors weren't close enough to overhear. Yes, go ahead. Your grandfather was more strategic about the family business than anyone realized. Through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles, he maintained a 31% ownership stake in Westfield Industries. Those holdings are now part of your inheritance. I sat down heavily, my coffee cup trembling in my hand. 31%? But Derek inherited controlling interest. Derek inherited 49%, which made him the largest single shareholder, but not necessarily the controlling shareholder. The remaining 20% is held by employees, outside investors, and a small charitable trust. Here's where it gets interesting, Maya. If you combine your 31% with the employees' stock options and the charitable trust, you could potentially control 51% of the company. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Derek didn't have the absolute control over Westfield Industries that he thought he did. My grandfather had quietly maintained a position that could challenge Derek's authority, and he'd passed that power to me without anyone knowing it existed. James, are you telling me that I could theoretically override Derek's decisions as CEO? More than theoretically. Legally, if you can secure the support of the minority shareholders, you could remove Derek from his position entirely. Your grandfather structured these holdings very carefully, Maya. He wanted you to have options if Derek proved himself unworthy of the responsibility. I walked to my living room and sank into my reading chair, my mind racing through the possibilities. Derek's questionable consulting fees, his executive compensation restructuring, his dismissive attitude toward the employees my grandfather had wanted to protect. All of it could be challenged now that I understood my actual position. What would I need to do to exercise this kind of control? First, you'd need to formally identify yourself as the beneficial owner of these holdings. That would require legal documentation and potentially some public disclosure, depending on how you want to structure the reveal. Second, you'd need to build a coalition with the other minority shareholders. They'd have to trust that your leadership would be better for the company than Derek's current management. And third, James chuckled softly. Third, you'd need to be prepared for the nuclear fallout when Derek realizes that his little sister has just become his boss. After we hung up, I spent the morning pacing around my apartment, trying to process what I'd learned. In the space of a single phone call, I'd gone from secret heir to potential corporate power broker. The quiet phase of my inheritance was definitively over. But more than the practical implications, I was struck by the depth of my grandfather's planning. He hadn't just given me money and hoped I'd use it wisely. He'd positioned me to intervene in family affairs if his other heirs proved themselves unworthy of their responsibilities. The whole inheritance structure was an elaborate test, with safety valves built in to correct course if necessary. Derek had failed the test spectacularly, and he didn't even know he was taking it. My phone rang just after noon. Derek's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity and a newfound sense of power made me answer. Maya, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me at the country club for lunch? I'm buying. His tone was serious, almost urgent, which immediately put me on alert. Derek never invited me to the Riverside Country Club, the exclusive establishment where our family had maintained a membership for 3 generations. I'd been there exactly twice in my adult life, both times for formal family events, where my presence was required rather than desired. What's this about, Derek? I'd rather discuss it in person. It's about family business and some decisions I need to make regarding Westfield Industries. Your input could be valuable. My input could be valuable. Coming from Derek, this was revolutionary language. Something had shifted in his perspective, though I couldn't imagine what. I'll be there at 1, I said. The Riverside Country Club occupied a sprawling estate overlooking the Connecticut River, with manicured golf courses, tennis courts, and a clubhouse that looked like it had been transported directly from colonial Virginia. The interior was all dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and oil paintings of long-dead members who'd built their fortunes in manufacturing and finance. Derek was waiting for me in the main dining room, seated at a corner table that offered privacy from the other members scattered throughout the space. He stood when he saw me approaching, which was unusual. Derek rarely bothered with such formal courtesies, especially not with family. Maya, thank you for coming. You look well. I settled into the chair across from him, noting the tension in his posture and the way his fingers drummed against the white tablecloth. Derek was nervous about something, which was fascinating. I'd rarely seen him anything other than supremely confident. So what's this family business you wanted to discuss? Derek glanced around the dining room, then leaned forward slightly. I've been getting some pressure from the board about certain decisions I've made since taking over as CEO. Nothing serious, just questions about consulting fees and executive compensation. Some of the older members are very conservative about change. The consulting fees. Someone had obviously noticed the same irregularities that had caught my attention in the quarterly report. Derek was facing scrutiny, and he was worried about it. What kind of questions? They want detailed documentation of what services Chen's strategic development is providing, and they're questioning whether the fees are justified given the company's current performance metrics. It's all very bureaucratic and tedious, but I need to show unity within the family to maintain confidence in my leadership. Unity within the family. This was why Derek had invited me to lunch. He wanted to use our family connection to bolster his credibility with skeptical board members, to present a united front that would discourage further questioning of his business practices. What does that have to do with me? I was hoping you might consider taking a more visible role in company affairs. Nothing that would interfere with your teaching, of course, but maybe joining the board of directors as a family representative. Your presence would demonstrate that the entire Chen family supports my vision for Westfield Industries. The irony was staggering. Derek wanted me to join the board of directors of a company I already secretly controlled. He was asking me to provide political cover for the very business practices I was considering challenging through my shareholding position. Derek, I don't know anything about running a manufacturing company. What could I possibly contribute as a board member? You don't need operational expertise, Maya. You just need to be present and supportive. The board needs to see that Grandpa Harry's granddaughter trusts my judgment and believes in the direction I'm taking the company. His casual assumption that I would automatically support his decisions was remarkable. Derek couldn't conceive of a world where I might have my own opinions about corporate governance or the ability to challenge his authority. What's in it for me? The question seemed to surprise him. Derek blinked twice, then attempted his most persuasive smile. Well, board members receive compensation for their service. It's not much, maybe $20,000 a year, but it would be a nice supplement to your teaching salary. Plus, you'd gain valuable business experience that could open doors to other opportunities. $20,000. Derek was offering me a pittance to provide political cover for practices that were potentially costing the company millions of dollars in questionable fees and inflated compensation. The condescension was breathtaking. I'll need to think about it, I said carefully. Of course, take all the time you need. But Maya, I hope you'll seriously consider this opportunity. It would mean a lot to me personally, and I think it could be really good for your career development. We ordered lunch and spent the next hour discussing Derek's plans for expanding Westfield Industries into new markets and modernizing the company's operations. His vision was ambitious and potentially profitable, but it was also focused entirely on short-term gains and efficiency improvements. There was no mention of employee welfare, community impact, or long-term sustainability. As Derek talked, I found myself thinking about the notes my grandfather had kept, his concerns about Derek's lack of empathy, and his tendency to see people as resources rather than individuals. This lunch was validating every one of those concerns in real time. The key, Derek was saying, is to eliminate redundancies and streamline operations. We're carrying too many employees relative to our productivity metrics. I'm planning to reduce headcount by about 15% over the next 2 years, which should improve our profit margins significantly. 15%. Derek was planning to fire roughly 30 people to boost profits, despite the fact that my grandfather's will had specifically required him to maintain current employment levels for 5 years. Derek, didn't Grandpa Harry's will include provisions about maintaining employment levels? His expression tightened slightly. That was more of a guideline than a hard requirement. The legal language allows for adjustments based on business necessity and market conditions. My attorneys have reviewed it thoroughly. His attorneys. Derek had obviously been looking for loopholes in my grandfather's wishes from the moment he'd inherited the company. The employment protection that had been intended to safeguard workers' livelihoods had become just another obstacle for Derek to navigate around. What do the employees think about these potential layoffs? They don't know about them yet. We're still in the planning phase. But Maya, this is exactly why I need family support on the board. Changes like this are never popular in the short term, but they're necessary for long-term competitiveness. I need board members who trust my judgment and won't be swayed by emotional arguments from employees who don't understand the bigger picture. Emotional arguments. Derek was characterizing concerns about people's jobs and livelihoods as emotional arguments that interfered with rational business decisions. The disconnect between his perspective and basic human empathy was profound. After lunch, Derek walked me to the parking lot, still pressing his case for my board membership. Think about it, Maya. This could be a real opportunity for you to expand your horizons beyond the classroom. Plus, working together would bring our family closer, and I think that's what Grandpa Harry would have wanted. What Grandpa Harry would have wanted? Derek was invoking our grandfather's memory to justify exactly the kind of behavior that had concerned him most about Derek's character and judgment. I drove home with my decision already made, though not the decision Derek was hoping for. I wouldn't be joining his board as a compliant family representative. Instead, I would be exercising my actual authority as the company's largest potential shareholder to hold him accountable for his actions. That afternoon, I called Dr. Rodriguez and requested an emergency meeting. When I explained what I'd learned about my shareholding position and Derek's plans for layoffs, her response was immediate and decisive. Maya, you need to act quickly if you want to prevent those job cuts. Once Derek implements the layoffs, it becomes much more difficult to challenge them legally, even if you have the shareholder authority to do so. We scheduled a meeting for Monday morning to discuss strategy and legal options. Dr. Rodriguez also recommended that I contact the employee shareholders and the charitable trust to gauge their willingness to support a challenge to Derek's management. The key, she explained, is building your coalition before Derek realizes what's happening. Once he understands that his control is being challenged, he'll take defensive measures that could make your position more difficult. Sunday evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the employee stock option documents that James Morrison had sent over. 23 current and former Westfield Industries employees owned shares in the company, with holdings ranging from 0.5% to 3% each. Most of them had been granted stock options as part of their compensation packages over the years, rewards for long service and exceptional performance. These were people who had built their careers at Westfield Industries, who had invested their professional lives in the company's success. Derek's planned layoffs would devastate not just the employees who lost their jobs, but the entire workplace culture that my grandfather had spent decades creating. I made a list of the employee shareholders, starting with the largest holdings and working my way down. Many of the names were familiar from my childhood visits to the company headquarters, people who had known my grandfather personally and had been part of the Westfield Industries family for 20 or 30 years. The largest employee shareholder was a woman named Linda Martinez, the company's head of human resources. She owned 2.8% of Westfield Industries and had worked there for 26 years. If anyone would understand the impact of Derek's planned changes, it would be Linda. I found her contact information in the employee directory and crafted a careful email requesting a private meeting to discuss concerns about the company's future direction. I didn't mention my shareholding position or my relationship to Derek, just identified myself as Harold Westfield's granddaughter who was interested in learning more about the company's operations. Linda responded within 2 hours, suggesting we meet for coffee Tuesday evening at a small cafe near the Westfield Industries headquarters. Her reply was polite but cautious, and I sensed that she was curious about why Harold Westfield's granddaughter was suddenly interested in employee perspectives. Monday's meeting with Dr. Rodriguez took place in her office conference room, with documents spread across the mahogany table like pieces of a complex puzzle. She'd spent the weekend researching the legal precedents for shareholder challenges to CEO decisions, and her findings were encouraging. "You have multiple grounds for challenging Derek's authority," she explained. "The planned layoffs violate the employment provisions in Harold's will, which creates a breach of fiduciary duty. The consulting fees to Chen's strategic development appear to be self-dealing without proper board oversight. And his executive compensation restructuring may violate SEC regulations for closely held companies. What would be the process for removing Derek as CEO? First, you'd need to call a special shareholders meeting. As a 31% shareholder, you have the right to do that at any time. Second, you'd need to present a formal motion of no confidence in Derek's leadership, supported by documentation of his violations. Third, you'd need majority shareholder support to remove him from his position and elect new leadership. The timeline would be tight, but it was feasible. If I could secure the support of the employee shareholders and the charitable trust, I could potentially remove Derek from his CEO position before he had a chance to implement the layoffs or continue his questionable financial practices. Dr. Rodriguez, what happens if Derek fights this? He's not going to accept removal quietly. He'll probably challenge the validity of your shareholding claims and argue that the employee stock options don't carry voting rights. But James Morrison has excellent documentation of your inheritance, and most employee stock options do include voting privileges unless specifically excluded. Derek's legal position would be much weaker than yours. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Emma. Her voice was excited but also puzzled. "Maya, something strange happened at work today. Linda Martinez from Westfield Industries called me at the Literacy Center. She said she'd heard I was working on educational initiatives and wanted to know if I'd be interested in partnering with the company on a literacy program for employees and their families." Linda Martinez, the head of human resources who I was planning to meet the next evening. She was apparently already thinking about ways to support employee development, which suggested that Derek's plans for layoffs weren't widely known within the company yet. That sounds like a great opportunity, Em. What did you tell her? I said I'd be interested in discussing it further. She wants to set up a meeting for next week to talk about potential partnerships. Maya, isn't it funny how these opportunities keep appearing just when I'm ready for them? If only she knew how orchestrated some of these opportunities actually were. But Emma's natural enthusiasm and talent were genuine, and they were opening doors that I could support from behind the scenes. Maybe it's a sign that you're on the right path, I said. Tuesday evening, I arrived at the Grounded Cafe 15 minutes early and chose a corner table that offered privacy from the other customers. The cafe was busy with the after-work crowd, young professionals grabbing coffee and pastries before heading home or to evening activities. Linda Martinez walked in at exactly 6 o'clock, scanning the room until she spotted me waving from the corner table. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying brown hair and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her handshake was firm, and her smile was warm but cautious. Ms. Chen, thank you for reaching out. I have to admit, I'm curious about what Harold's granddaughter wants to discuss with me. I'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times, trying to find the right balance between honesty and strategic discretion. Linda deserved to know why I was really there, but I also needed to protect my larger plans until I was ready to reveal them. Ms. Martinez, I'm concerned about some changes that might be coming to Westfield Industries. I've heard rumors about potential layoffs and restructuring, and I wanted to understand how those changes might affect the employees who've made the company successful. Her expression grew serious immediately. What kind of rumors have you heard? That Derek is planning to reduce headcount by 15% over the next 2 years to improve profit margins. Have you heard anything similar? Linda was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with deliberate precision. When she looked up, her eyes were troubled. There have been discussions. Nothing official, but Derek has asked me to prepare contingency plans for workforce reductions. He says it's just strategic planning, but the timeline suggests he's serious about implementation. How do the other employees feel about Derek's leadership so far? Honestly, they're nervous. Derek's management style is very different from his grandfather's approach. Harold valued stability and employee loyalty. Derek seems more focused on efficiency and profitability, which isn't necessarily bad, but it creates uncertainty about job security. This was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. The employees were already concerned about Derek's leadership, which would make them more receptive to alternative management if I could present a credible option. Ms. Martinez, what if I told you that there might be ways to challenge Derek's decisions if they violate the terms of my grandfather's will or the company's fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders? She leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. What kind of ways? Legal ways, shareholder ways. Ways that could protect the employees and ensure that Westfield Industries continues to operate according to the values my grandfather established. Are you talking about some kind of shareholder revolt? I'm talking about accountability. Derek inherited significant responsibilities along with his authority, and if he's not meeting those responsibilities, there are mechanisms to address that. Linda studied my face for several seconds, clearly trying to assess whether I was serious and whether I had the resources to back up my implications. Ms. Chen, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, you'd need significant shareholder support. Derek controls 49% of the company. Even if all the employee shareholders supported you, that's only about 12% combined. I smiled, enjoying the moment of revelation. What if I told you that there are other shareholders, significant ones, who might be willing to support responsible leadership? I'd ask you to be more specific. I'd tell you that my grandfather was more strategic about corporate governance than anyone realized, and that Derek's control isn't as absolute as he believes it to be. We talked for another hour, with Linda asking increasingly detailed questions about my plans and resources. I couldn't reveal everything, but I shared enough information to convince her that I was serious, and that I had the potential backing to make a real challenge to Derek's authority. By the time we parted ways, Linda had agreed to discreetly sound out the other employee shareholders about their concerns with Derek's leadership and their potential interest in supporting alternative management. She also promised to keep me informed about any developments regarding the planned layoffs or other major changes to company operations. Ms. Chen, she said as we stood to leave, I hope you know what you're doing. Derek won't take kindly to having his authority challenged, especially not by family. Ms. Martinez, my grandfather didn't leave me this responsibility so I could take the easy path. He left it to me because he trusted me to do what was right, even when it was difficult. As I drove home through the October evening, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just a few weeks. I'd gone from feeling dismissed and undervalued to discovering that I held more power than anyone in my family realized. The quiet school teacher had become a strategic player in corporate governance, with the resources and knowledge to hold Derek accountable for his actions. But more than the power dynamics, I was struck by the moral clarity of my position. Derek was planning to fire 30 people to boost profits, despite inheriting a company with the specific requirement that he protect their jobs. He was funneling money to his own consulting company without proper oversight or documentation. He was restructuring executive compensation to benefit himself at the expense of other shareholders. These weren't complex ethical dilemmas requiring careful deliberation. They were clear violations of his responsibilities as CEO and as the heir to my grandfather's legacy. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek as I parked in front of my apartment. Maya, have you given any more thought to the board position? I'd like to announce your appointment at next week's meeting if you're interested. I stared at the message, thinking about how different Derek's world was about to become. He was still operating under the assumption that I was the struggling younger sister who needed his guidance and financial support. He had no idea that I was positioning myself to become his biggest problem. I typed back a simple response. Still thinking it over, I'll let you know soon. Soon indeed. By next week, Derek would understand exactly what kind of thinking I'd been doing, and exactly what kind of board oversight Westfield Industries was about to receive. The game was almost ready to begin, and Derek had no idea he was already losing. The call came at exactly 8:47 on Thursday morning, while I was reviewing quarterly financial reports from 3 different offshore accounts. Linda Martinez's voice was tight with urgency, and I could hear office noise in the background, despite her obvious attempt to find a private space. Maya, Derek just announced an emergency board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. Word is spreading through the office that he's planning to implement the layoffs immediately, starting Monday morning. He's moved up his timeline significantly. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, my mind immediately shifting into crisis mode. Derek had accelerated his plans, which meant he'd either detected some threat to his authority or decided that swift action was preferable to prolonged deliberation. Either way, my window for intervention was closing rapidly. How many people know about the layoffs? Management level and above, maybe 15 or 20 people total. Derek called it a strategic restructuring to optimize operational efficiency. The employees who are about to lose their jobs have no idea what's coming. Linda, I need you to contact every employee shareholder today. Tell them there's going to be an emergency shareholders meeting this afternoon at 4 o'clock, and that their attendance is crucial for protecting their interests. Don't mention my name specifically, just say that concerned shareholders are calling for a review of current management decisions. There was a pause, and I could hear Linda's intake of breath. Maya, are you really doing this? Are you actually challenging Derek's authority? I'm exercising my rights as a shareholder to ensure that this company operates according to the values and commitments my grandfather established. Derek has violated the terms of his inheritance, and he's about to destroy the livelihoods of 30 families. Yes, I'm challenging his authority. After hanging up with Linda, I immediately called Dr. Rodriguez and James Morrison, requesting an emergency conference call to coordinate our legal strategy. Within an hour, we had established a timeline for serving Derek with official notice of the shareholders' meeting, documentation of his violations, and formal paperwork for his removal as CEO. Maya, Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the focused intensity of someone preparing for legal battle. Once we serve Derek with these papers, there's no going back. He'll know exactly what you're doing, and he'll fight with everything he has. Are you prepared for that level of family conflict? I thought about the condescending lunch at the country club, Derek's casual dismissal of employee welfare, his assumption that I would provide political cover for his questionable practices without asking difficult questions. I thought about my grandfather's notes, his concerns about Derek's character, and his trust in my judgment. Dr. Rodriguez, my grandfather didn't give me this responsibility so I could avoid difficult conversations. He gave it to me because he knew I would prioritize doing what's right over maintaining family harmony. By noon, the legal machinery was in motion. Derek would receive official notice of the shareholders' meeting within the next 2 hours, along with documentation of the specific violations that justified his removal as CEO. The employee shareholders had been contacted and briefed on the situation, and according to Linda's reports, their response was overwhelmingly supportive. But the most crucial conversation was still ahead of me. At 1:30, I called Emma and asked her to meet me immediately at the Lighthouse Cafe. Her voice carried concern when she agreed, probably sensing the unusual urgency in my request. Emma arrived 20 minutes later, her face flushed from rushing and her expression worried. She slid into the chair across from me with the kind of focused attention that suggested she knew something significant was happening. "Maya, you sounded strange on the phone. Is everything okay?" I'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times, but sitting across from Emma, I realized that no amount of preparation could make this revelation easy. She was about to learn that everything she thought she knew about our family's financial situation was wrong, and that her sister had been keeping secrets that would fundamentally change our relationships with each other and with Derek. I need to tell you something important about Grandpa Harry's inheritance, and I need you to listen without interrupting until I'm finished." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. The inheritance reading we attended was theater. Derek didn't inherit controlling interest in Westfield Industries, and I didn't inherit books and a summer house. Grandpa Harry left me something much more significant, and he structured it so that Derek wouldn't know until I was ready to reveal it. I told her everything. The offshore accounts, the $200 million, the 31% ownership stake in Westfield Industries, Derek's violations of the employment protections, his questionable consulting fees, and my plans to remove him as CEO that very afternoon. Emma sat perfectly still throughout my explanation, her face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and something that might have been awe. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing information that challenged every assumption she'd made about our family dynamics. "Maya," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you telling me that you're worth over $200 million? I'm telling you that Grandpa Harry trusted me with resources that come with enormous responsibilities, and that Derek has proven himself unworthy of the trust he inherited. But why didn't you tell me sooner? We're sisters. I've been worried about you struggling financially while you were secretly managing a fortune." The hurt in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt a pang of guilt about the deception. But I also knew that Emma's tendency to share information freely would have made it impossible to maintain the secrecy necessary for my current plans. I needed time to understand what I'd inherited and develop a strategy for using it responsibly. And honestly, I needed to observe how you and Derek handled your own inheritances before deciding how much to reveal. "What do you mean? Observe how we handled our inheritances?" "I mean that Grandpa Harry was testing all of us. He wanted to see what we would do with money and power, how we would treat other people, what values would guide our decisions. Derek failed that test spectacularly, but you didn't." I told her about the anonymous donation to the Hartford Literacy Initiative, about my role in creating the opportunity that had launched her career in educational philanthropy. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she realized that her recent professional success had been secretly supported by her sister. "You did that? You've been helping me this whole time? I've been creating opportunities for you to show who you really are. Your passion, your work ethic, your genuine care for other people, that's all you. I just made sure you had the resources to make a real impact." Emma reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her grip tight with emotion. "Maya, I don't know what to say. This is overwhelming." "I know it is, but I need your help this afternoon. Derek is about to fire 30 people to boost profits, and I'm going to stop him. I need you there as a witness and as a supporter when I reveal the truth about my inheritance." "What exactly are you going to do?" "I'm going to call a shareholders meeting, present evidence of Derek's violations, and remove him as CEO of Westfield Industries. Then I'm going to make sure the company operates according to the values Grandpa Harry established, with proper protection for employees and responsible financial management." Emma was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what I was planning. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and determined. "What do you need me to do?" At 3:45 that afternoon, I walked into the Westfield Industries headquarters for the first time in over 5 years. The building looked exactly as I remembered it, a modest three-story structure in an industrial park on the outskirts of Hartford. The lobby featured a wall of photographs documenting the company's history, including several pictures of my grandfather with employees at company picnics and retirement celebrations. Linda Martinez met me at the reception desk, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes bright with anticipation. "Maya, everyone is here. The conference room is full." The main conference room buzzed with nervous energy as 26 employee shareholders took their seats around an oversized table and along the walls. These were people I recognized from childhood visits, faces that had aged but remained familiar. They looked confused but hopeful, clearly understanding that something significant was about to happen but uncertain about the details. Derek stood at the head of the table, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. He'd obviously received the legal papers I'd had served, and his face was flushed with the kind of rage that comes from being ambushed by someone you've consistently underestimated. Emma entered the room behind me, taking a seat near the back where she could observe without drawing attention. Her presence gave me strength, a reminder that not all family relationships were built on competition and dismissal. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "thank you for attending this emergency shareholders meeting. I've called this meeting to address serious concerns about the current management of Westfield Industries and to propose changes that will protect both the company's long-term interests and the welfare of its employees." Derek stepped forward, his voice sharp with authority. "Maya, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you have no standing to call shareholders meetings. You're not even a shareholder in this company." I opened the leather portfolio Dr. Rodriguez had prepared and removed a thick stack of legal documents. "Actually, Derek, I am. Through a series of trust structures and investment vehicles established by our grandfather, I own 31% of Westfield Industries. These documents, filed with the Delaware Secretary of State and notarized by the appropriate authorities, establish my legal standing as the company's largest single shareholder." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as I distributed copies of the ownership documentation to the employee shareholders. Derek's face went white as he realized that his assumptions about corporate control had been catastrophically wrong. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Grandpa Harry would have told me if he was maintaining a significant ownership stake. Our grandfather told you exactly what he wanted you to know, Derek. He also left detailed records of his concerns about your management philosophy and your treatment of the employees he'd spent decades protecting." I opened a second folder and began reading excerpts from my grandfather's notes. Derek's face grew progressively redder as I recounted his dismissive comments about employee welfare, his focus on short-term profits over long-term stability, and his general lack of empathy for the people whose livelihoods depended on Westfield Industries. "These observations," I continued, "were made over several years as our grandfather evaluated whether you were worthy of the responsibility he was considering giving you. Unfortunately, Derek, your recent actions have validated every one of his concerns." "What actions?" Derek demanded, though his defensive tone suggested he already knew. "The consulting fees you've been paying to Chen Strategic Development, a company you created 3 months after inheriting your position. $2 million in fees for unspecified services, with no oversight or documentation of what work was actually performed. That's self-dealing, Derek, and it violates your fiduciary duty to the other shareholders." Linda Martinez leaned forward in her chair. "Derek, is that true? Have you been paying your own company consulting fees?" Derek's jaw tightened. "Those fees are for legitimate business consulting services, market analysis, strategic planning, operational optimization. Everything I'm doing is designed to improve the company's profitability and competitiveness." "Including the layoffs you announced this morning?" I asked. "The plan to fire 30 employees, representing 15% of our workforce, to boost profit margins?" A gasp went around the room as the employee shareholders realized that their jobs were in jeopardy. Several people began talking at once, their voices rising with concern and anger. "Derek," called out Tom Rodriguez, a machinist who'd worked at Westfield Industries for 18 years, "you told us the workforce reductions were just contingency planning. You said there were no immediate plans for layoffs. The business environment is constantly changing, Derek replied, his voice defensive. Management has to be prepared to make difficult decisions to ensure the company's survival and growth. What about Grandpa Harry's will? Linda asked. Didn't he specifically require you to maintain current employment levels? Derek's expression grew even more rigid. The will includes language about business necessity and market conditions. My attorneys have reviewed the employment provisions thoroughly, and they agree that the changes I'm proposing are legally permissible. I stood up, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Derek's attorneys may have found legal loopholes, but that doesn't make his actions ethically acceptable or consistent with our grandfather's wishes. Harold Westfield built this company on the principle that employees were partners in success, not disposable resources to be eliminated when profit margins needed improvement. I turned to address the employee shareholders directly. Ladies and gentlemen, you have voting rights as shareholders in this company. You have the power to hold management accountable for decisions that affect your livelihoods and your professional futures. Today, I'm asking you to exercise that power. Tom Rodriguez raised his hand. Maya, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we remove Derek Chen from his position as CEO and replace him with leadership that will honor our grandfather's values and commitments. As the holder of 31% of company shares, combined with your collective ownership of approximately 12%, we have the voting power to make this change immediately. Derek slammed his hand on the conference table. This is ridiculous. Maya, you can't just walk in here and stage a corporate coup because you disagree with my business decisions. I inherited this company because I have the knowledge and experience to run it successfully. You inherited this company because our grandfather hoped you would grow into the responsibility. Unfortunately, Derek, you've proven that his hope was misplaced. I opened a third folder and removed the Cayman Islands bank statements that James Morrison had prepared. Derek, you've spent the past few months assuming that you inherited the real Westfield fortune and that I received the leftover scraps. You've patronized me, dismissed my opinions, and treated me like a child who needed your guidance and protection. Derek's eyes narrowed as he realized I was building toward a major revelation. Maya, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the $237 million in offshore accounts that our grandfather actually left to me. I'm talking about the fact that while you've been congratulating yourself on inheriting a company worth roughly $60 million, I've been managing a portfolio worth nearly 4 times that amount. The conference room fell completely silent. Emma, who had heard this information earlier, watched Derek's face with a mixture of fascination and pity. The employee shareholders looked stunned, clearly struggling to process the idea that quiet Maya Chen was secretly wealthier than anyone in the room had imagined. Derek stared at me for several seconds, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. $237 million? That's correct. Our grandfather didn't trust you with the real family fortune, Derek. He gave you a test, and you've failed it completely. Derek's face cycled through several different expressions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally something that looked like desperate calculation. Maya, if what you're saying is true, then we need to discuss this as a family, privately. These people don't need to be involved in our personal financial arrangements. These people are shareholders in the company you've been mismanaging, Derek. They have every right to know that the person making decisions about their jobs and their futures has been prioritizing his own financial interests over their welfare. Linda Martinez stood up, her voice clear and determined. Maya, if you're serious about removing Derek as CEO, you have my vote and my support. I've watched him operate for 6 months, and I've seen enough. Tom Rodriguez nodded emphatically. Mine too. Derek, I'm sorry, but you've lost our confidence. One by one, the employee shareholders voiced their support for Derek's removal and their willingness to trust my leadership. The final vote was overwhelming 24 in favor of the no confidence motion, with only 2 abstentions and Derek himself voting against. Derek sat down heavily, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. Maya, you can't do this. I'm family. We can work out our differences privately, without destroying everything I've built here. Derek, you haven't built anything here. You've inherited a successful company and spent 6 months figuring out how to extract maximum personal benefit from it. That's not leadership, that's exploitation. I turned to address the room again. Ladies and gentlemen, as the new majority shareholder and acting CEO of Westfield Industries, my first official decision is to cancel the planned layoffs immediately. No employee will lose their job as part of any cost-cutting measures. Second, I'm ordering a complete audit of all consulting fees and executive compensation changes implemented since Derek assumed leadership. Any funds that were improperly diverted will be returned to the company. The applause that erupted from the employee shareholders was spontaneous and enthusiastic. These were people who had been facing unemployment on Monday morning, and now they were hearing that their jobs were secure and their workplace would be managed according to principles they understood and respected. Derek stood up slowly, his posture defeated, but his voice still carrying a trace of defiance. Maya, you may have won this battle, but you don't know anything about running a manufacturing company. You'll destroy everything our grandfather built. Derek, our grandfather built this company on the principle that success should benefit everyone who contributes to it, not just the people in executive positions. I may not have an MBA, but I understand those values perfectly. Emma approached me as the employee shareholders began to file out of the conference room, their conversations animated with relief and excitement. Her eyes were bright with what looked like pride, mixed with amazement. Maya, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Derek overheard her comment and turned to face Emma with an expression of bitter betrayal. Emma, you knew about this. You knew what Maya was planning and you didn't warn me? Emma's voice was steady and unapologetic. Derek, Maya showed me evidence of what you've been doing to this company and its employees. I chose to support the person who was fighting for what's right. What's right? Derek's voice rose with indignation. Emma, Maya just staged a hostile takeover of our family's business using money that she's been hiding from us for months. How is that right? Derek, I said quietly, I didn't hide money from you. I discovered an inheritance that our grandfather specifically didn't want you to know about until you proved yourself worthy of that knowledge. Unfortunately, your actions over the past 6 months have proven the opposite. Derek stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him cycling through different strategies for salvaging the situation. Finally, he seemed to reach some internal decision, and his expression hardened with resolve. Maya, this isn't over. I'm going to fight this decision through every legal channel available. I'm going to challenge your ownership claims, your authority to remove me, and your right to make unilateral decisions about a company that's been in our family for 3 generations. Derek, you have every right to pursue legal challenges. But while you're filing lawsuits and depositions, I'll be running Westfield Industries according to the principles our grandfather established. The employees will keep their jobs, the company will operate ethically, and the profits will be shared fairly among all the stakeholders who contribute to our success. After Derek stormed out of the conference room, I spent another hour meeting with the employee shareholders and key staff members, outlining my immediate plans for the company's operations and management structure. Linda Martinez agreed to serve as interim operations manager while I searched for a permanent CEO, with the experience and values necessary to run the company effectively. Maya, Linda said as we wrapped up the meeting, I have to ask, what made you decide to reveal your inheritance now? You could have continued managing your money quietly without getting involved in the family business. Linda, our grandfather didn't give me this responsibility so I could live comfortably while other people suffered from poor decisions. He gave it to me because he trusted me to use these resources to protect the things he cared about most. This company and its employees were at the top of that list. That evening, I drove to the summer house in New Hampshire, needing space and quiet to process everything that had happened. Emma had offered to come with me, but I wanted time alone to think about the implications of my actions and the responsibilities that lay ahead. The house felt different now, charged with significance in ways that went beyond nostalgia and sentiment. This was where I'd discovered the truth about my inheritance, where I'd begun to understand my grandfather's real intentions and expectations. This was where I'd started the journey that had led to today's confrontation with Derek, and my assumption of real power within the family business. I sat on the dock as the sun set over Lake Winnisquam, watching the water reflect the brilliant colors of the October sky. My phone buzzed occasionally with text messages from employees thanking me for saving their jobs, from Emma checking to make sure I was okay, and from James Morrison congratulating me on a successful transition of corporate leadership. But there was also a message from my father, brief and tense. Maya, Derek told us what happened today. We need to talk as a family. I stared at the message for several minutes, considering my response. My parents had always favored Derek, always assumed that his success reflected well on their parenting, while my different choices suggested some kind of failure or rebellion. They would probably see today's events as a betrayal of family loyalty, rather than an assertion of moral responsibility. But I was no longer the insecure daughter who needed their approval or their understanding. I was the granddaughter Harold Westfield had chosen to carry forward his legacy. The person he'd trusted with the resources and authority to make difficult decisions when necessary. I typed back a simple response. Dad, I did what Grandpa Harry would have wanted me to do. If you'd like to discuss it, I'm available. As darkness settled over the lake, I found myself thinking about the conversations I'd had with my grandfather during his final weeks in the hospital. He'd talked about responsibility and integrity, about the importance of making decisions based on values rather than convenience. He'd never explicitly told me that I would inherit his real fortune, but he'd prepared me for the moral challenges that would come with it. Still waters run deep, Maya, he'd said during one of our last conversations. People will underestimate you because you're quiet and thoughtful, but that's their mistake. When the time comes to act, you'll know what to do. He'd been right. When Derek had revealed his plans to fire 30 employees and enrich himself through questionable consulting fees, I'd known exactly what to do. The knowledge, the resources, and the moral clarity had all been there when I needed them. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. James Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. Maya, I wanted to check in on you after today's events. How are you feeling about everything? Exhausted, I admitted, but also relieved. Derek needed to be stopped, and I'm glad I had the power to do it. Your grandfather would be very proud of you. He always said that true strength wasn't about dominating other people, but about protecting the things that mattered most. You've honored that principle beautifully. James, what happens now? Derek threatened legal challenges, and I suspect my parents are going to pressure me to find some kind of compromise that restores family harmony. Maya, you have excellent legal representation and unassailable documentation of your ownership rights. Derek can file whatever lawsuits he wants, but his position is extremely weak. As for family pressure, that's something only you can navigate. But remember that your primary responsibility is to the legacy your grandfather entrusted to you, not to maintaining relationships with people who don't share your values. After we hung up, I walked back into the house and made myself a cup of tea, settling into the same chair where I'd first read my grandfather's letter about the real inheritance. The brass key still sat on the side table, and I picked it up, turning it over in my fingers while I thought about everything that had changed since that revelatory weekend. 6 weeks ago, I'd been Maya Chen, high school English teacher with a modest inheritance and a family that consistently undervalued her contributions. Tonight, I was Maya Chen, CEO of a $60 million manufacturing company and secret manager of a global financial empire worth over $200 million. But more than the titles and the money, I was someone who had discovered her own strength and moral authority. I was someone who had stood up to family pressure and corporate misconduct, who had protected 30 families from unemployment, and who had proven herself worthy of the trust my grandfather had placed in her. The transformation was remarkable, but it was also just the beginning. Running Westfield Industries responsibly would require expertise I didn't yet possess, relationships I needed to build, and strategic decisions about the company's future direction. Managing the offshore accounts would demand constant attention to global markets, investment opportunities, and charitable giving priorities. And navigating the family dynamics that my actions had disrupted would require patience, wisdom, and probably a willingness to accept that some relationships might never recover from today's revelations. But as I sat in my grandfather's house, surrounded by the books he'd loved, and the memories of conversations that had shaped my understanding of responsibility and integrity, I felt ready for all of it. Harold Westfield had chosen me for this role because he believed I had the character and judgment to handle complex challenges without losing sight of what mattered most. Tomorrow, I would start the work of proving him right. I would learn everything I needed to know about manufacturing operations, financial management, and corporate leadership. I would build relationships with employees, customers, and community partners who shared my commitment to ethical business practices. I would use the offshore accounts to support causes that aligned with my values and created positive change in the world. And I would do all of it as Maya Chen, not as someone trying to live up to other people's expectations or apologizing for her different approach to success and responsibility. My phone buzzed with one final message of the day, a text from Emma. "Maya, I'm so proud of you. Watching you today reminded me of something Grandpa Harry used to say about still waters running deep. You've always been stronger than any of us realized, including yourself. Sweet dreams." I smiled as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to the bedroom where I'd spent so many childhood summers. Emma was right about the still waters, and she was right about strength that had taken me years to recognize and embrace. But she was also right about something else. Tonight, for the first time in months, I would sleep deeply and peacefully, knowing that I'd honored my grandfather's trust and used my power to protect the people and principles that mattered most. The girl who had once felt invisible in her own family had become the woman who could change everything with a single shareholders meeting. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.